All right.
Yeah, let's give it up for James talking about authentication.
Cool. Awesome. Well, one, this is a really cool experience. So I've done a lot of talks. I've never actually done one formally remotely. I do a lot of kind of gauging how I'm doing based on the audience. So since I can't actually see everyone out there, I'm just going to assume like I'm crushing it. Everyone's super excited the whole time, and I'll just run with that. At least it'll make me feel better as I go. So what we're going to talk about today is user authentication in React. I've only got 4 slides because most of this is going to be hands-on. A little bit about me, and I'm not even like going into full display mode in PowerPoint just because of a couple of slides. But if you want to find me on anything social media, James Q Quick, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Twitch. Been doing that recently. I did a little bit of a live stream earlier, which we'll talk about in a second. And I consider myself to be 3 things: a developer, a speaker, and a teacher. And then outside of that, if there's anything else that you want to find, you can find it at my website at jamesqquick.com. So the Auth0 piece, actually, technically, I do have the senior title. That was never actually explained to me when I joined, so I don't know what qualifications there are for the senior description of the title, but I've got it, so I don't know what I did to get it, but it's there. So I do work at Auth0. It's a company that does basically authentication services for developers. So anytime, the simple example is you open an application and you click on a login and it says, all right, you can log in with Google or Twitter or Instagram or GitHub, things like that. Auth0 does basically a lot of the behind the scenes stuff to make that experience from a developer's point of view as easy as possible. Now, I do want to say, like, I didn't want this talk to be a product pitch. That's not what it's intended to be. Honestly, they had a spot open up, and this is what I've been kind of like onboarding myself to. I just started back in January. So this has been top of mind, and I've run through this stuff several times and figured it'd be a good thing to present. And I think it is worthwhile regardless of the product. And if you look for other products, it'll be relatively similar as well. So especially after we get done, if you have any questions on how identity or authentication works just in general outside of Auth0, feel free to ask and I'll help as best I can to explain that as well. So that's all the intro stuff that I've got. Want to talk a little bit about how identity works and especially how it works in the single page application space. So if you've ever worked with some sort of API, just in general, usually you get like an API key, or you might get an application ID or a secret key or something like that. I don't know how much you've thought about the difference, the small differences between those things, but a secret key is meant to be secret. And if you're a new developer, like I was several years ago, and you get a secret key and you check it into source control, then everybody can do whatever they want with your secret key and use your API, and that's not what you're supposed to do. So a secret key is supposed to be secret. The problem is in the browser, you can't guarantee that anything in your code is secret. So if something as simple as viewing source code for your HTML and your JavaScript, cross-site scripting of like going into local storage and getting whatever it is you have in there, you can't guarantee that anything that you have in the browser is secure, which changes the way that authentication works in a single page application. With a more traditional kind of server-side rendered application, you could have a secret, you could store it on the server, you can guarantee that that server can keep that secret versus something like React in the browser cannot necessarily guarantee to be able to keep that secret. So without getting into too much of the details of how the authentication process works, there is 2 things that I won't really dive into deeply at all, is OAuth2 and OpenID Connect. And the general idea of what these are workflows to, 1, get access tokens to then reference an API. So that would be your OAuth workflow. And then your OpenID Connect is basically to let users log into your application with other services like Twitter, GitHub, Google, that sort of stuff. And that's what we're going to leverage. Won't get into those details. The main thing is you don't really care, especially with Auth0 and similar competitors. Again, I don't want to be too Auth0 specific here. But with services out there that take care of this kind of stuff, adding authentication to your React application is really, really nice, honestly. So that's what we're going to look at. And earlier, I did a stream where we created a simple React application. And it's just tying into a movie database. So you could search for, we did Liar Liar earlier for movies, and it'll show you information about the movies that it gets back when it does the search. Not too complicated. Really, I wanted to do this, 1, so we could have like kind of a build-up stream to the talk. I thought it would be fun, and I had a good time. I think people that came had a good time as well. Also, I wanted it to be like, I didn't want to come in and do just like, here's my blank bare bones React application and I throw in authentication in it. I wanted to take almost like a real application. Again, not super complicated, but it's like just to kind of prove to you that it's not something that only works with the way I had it set up beforehand. So this is source code that we built earlier in about an hour and a half, and that's what we're going to work with, and that's what we're going to tie in authentication to. So we've got just a home page here. That's what we're on. You can search for movies. We've got a profile page, which doesn't show anything. And then we've got login and logout buttons that don't do anything. And obviously, we're going to make those work here in a second. So inside of Auth0, you can sign up completely free. When you do, you get what's called a tenant. And you can think of this kind of as like a cluster of your different applications, or you can group applications underneath your tenant, whatever you want to, however you want to think about it. It's kind of a group of applications. And obviously my great naming skills here of just kind of testing stuff out. This tenant is called training testy, whatever. So inside of here, I've got a list of applications. That's what you would do to get started. That's actually what we're going to do now, is go in and create an application. And there's lots of different types, obviously. We'll call this Reactadelphia demo. Hopefully I spelled that right. And this will be a single page application because we're using Angular. And we'll go ahead and create this. And what we're going to get is one thing that's most important here is the client ID. We'll see that in a second. And then once you go ahead and create the application, you have a quick start. And that's basically what I'm going to walk you through. So if you have any additional questions later on, please feel free to reach out and we'll talk about it. But we're basically going to do what's in the quick start here, so you can have a reference to do it later on if you want to as well. And just kind of walk through doing that and then integrating it into our React application. So the first thing we want to do is come into settings and scroll down to callback URLs. And so the way, a little bit about how this authentication workflow works is our application will actually redirect the user to Auth0 server. Auth0 will then handle the process of the actual logging in, and then they will redirect back to whatever URL we put inside of this allowed callback URL. So after they do their thing, Auth0 does its thing, it will then redirect the user back to our application, which in testing will be at localhost, not 8,000, but 3,000 for React. And actually, we're going to do this a couple times. So there's a, where do we want to allow people to log in from? We'll want to allow them from localhost 3000 as well. And then the logout URLs is going to be the same thing. So that's basically all the configuration that we need to do. Let's scroll down and save this. See, object didn't pass validation. I might need to do my HTTP. And then I'm going to copy that to all of these to make sure that that's all right. Hopefully that one. Nope. Let me actually go back to a different one and just make sure that I am typing that in right.
Hey, James, to interrupt a little bit, can I ask you to zoom in on your Chrome a little bit? I think it might help some of the people here in the space.
Is that a little better?
Yeah, so much better. Thank you so much.
Cool. Yep. Let's go back to applications and come back to Reactadelphia. I think those things, that should be a 3. Hopefully that will save now. There we go. Okay. So we've got a couple of things that says, hey, after Auth0, you do your thing, you're able to come back to this URL. That makes sure that like someone can't kind of hijack that process in the middle. It can only go back to certain domains that we specify in those settings. So with that done, I'm just going to kind of scroll through the quick start and I'll add a little bit of context on top of it as we go through. We've got the API keys. We'll grab those here in a second. We configured the callback, the logout URL, and the allowed web origin. We've got that. The default JWT token signing, don't really care. It's taken care of by default. It's set up appropriately. And then we get down to create a React application. We've got that. And then we want to install the Auth0 spa.js package. This is the latest package that we have for working with React. So let me close down the live server and do an npm install. While it's installing, I'm going to scroll back. We've already got React Router. That's already set up, so we don't have to worry about doing any setup for React Router. And then with React Router, you only have access to the history property if it's actually a page component. So if it's a component that gets rendered or displayed by the React Router. Since we're going to do this not necessarily inside of one of those, we can create a file that exports that history object so that we can access it anywhere. So inside of the source code, open that back up. I'm going to create a folder for utils. And, oh, that was a file, sorry. Let's do a folder, utils, and a file inside of that called history.js. And it just takes these two lines where you basically export the history object from React Router DOM. And then that way we can access it in other places. So we've got that set up. We've already got React Router set up. Then there's basically this like, this big boilerplate code. And this is one of the things that it's a little odd for quick starts. It's like, hey, just copying all this code. And then honestly, I don't think we do that great of a job of explaining what's going on. So I'm going to do this, but I'm going to give a little bit of context to what is going on inside of this. In the future, the thought is that this code will be abstracted into a React specific library to handle all this stuff for us, so we won't even have to do it. But let's add, what did they call it? React auth0 spa.js. So let's do a new file, React auth0 spa.js. And I'm just going to paste all this in, and then I'll talk a little bit about what it's doing. So one, this is going to use some cool features, newer features in React. So the hooks API and the context API. And I think I can actually see people. Hands up if you're using either React and or the context API. Lots of people. So this should be, for those people, probably relatively self-explanatory. So I won't spend too much time on it. We'll just kind of cover the basics from the perspective of auth. So there's start creating this auth provider, use hooks for several different properties that we want to keep track of. Is the user authenticated? Who is the user? What the auth0 client is, and then a loading property. This basically allows us to differentiate as our application is opening. We can display different content while the authentication process is going on behind the scenes. And sometimes that authentication process is not visible to the user. Let's say they've logged in and then they've refreshed the page. There's some behind the scenes stuff going on to make sure that the user is still logged in without having to prompt them for credentials and that sort of stuff. So we can use that loading property to make sure that all of that stuff is done before we actually display content to the user. So then we've got a use effect down here. This is basically going to actually create the auth0 hook, and then we will do a couple of things in here to check whether or not we've been redirected to. So after the login process happens on auth0, there's a redirect that comes back. It passes information inside of the URL, and this package will take care of getting that information out of it, holding on to it, and then we'll kind of use it later on. We track whether or not the user is authenticated. We put that using our hook, set is authenticated, and then if they are, we get track of the user as well. Again, this is basically boilerplate code. It's copy and paste. You throw it in there. You don't really have to worry about it after the fact. We've got a function for logging in with pop-up. We're going to do this a little bit differently. Handling the redirect callback. So after the callback comes back, we'll handle that and get the appropriate user information. And then lastly, the thing we care about most is the provider is going to have those pieces of information, namely is authenticated, user, loading, and then a couple of login and logout functions. So again, all boilerplate code, don't have to worry too much about that, but we will use this in a second. All right, so what I want to do is let's go into the header, make sure I'm following the steps in here as well. Let's see, create the navbar. Yeah, so inside of the navbar, we want to import the use auth0 hook. So hopefully I can get some IntelliSense in here. And from that, we're going to get out a couple of properties. So the properties that we want, make sure I pull this up and do it right, is the is authenticated login with redirect and log out. So those are the three things we want to get back from that hook. And I think, yeah, same thing right there. And so we can tie in the login button. Login, we can set the on click to the login with redirect, and then the log out to the log out. And so if we run this again, let's get this up and started. It's going to open up here. If we click the login button, looks like we've done something wrong. Oh, actually, I know what. We're not actually using this hook or the provider yet. So we need to wrap this application inside of the provider so that it has access to everything that it needs. So let's come back to this part here, integrate the SDK. This is where we're actually going to add the stuff that we need to inject that provider into the application. So I'm going to copy this redirect callback. This is just doing a little bit of extra work to handle the callback situation. We'll paste that in. We need to import the history from utils history. So history from utils history. All right, so that's going to take care of that one. And then we want to update what we render to wrap everything in this Auth0 provider. So I'm going to copy this render here and get rid of this part. And so we want to import the Auth0 provider. Can I get some IntelliSense to auto import this? Yes. And then we've got a couple of properties in here, the config, domain, and a client ID. So they put this in a JSON file. We don't really need to do that. We can just create this right inside of here. So let's convert this to a JavaScript object like that. And then we should get the config put in there. Now the domain is the identifier for the tenant, and then the client ID is basically the application ID that uniquely identifies the application that we're working on. What this will do by wrapping all of this with this Auth0 provider, it will allow that context information to be available inside of everything in the application. All right, so scrolling down a bit, then we've got some information that we can use inside of our app. We mentioned the loading process earlier. Let's actually, I'm going to come back to that. Let me refresh the home page here. Maybe you restart it. Did I miss putting something else in there? Let's see if we can get this to start back up. Object is not a function. And live coding is fun. Let's see. Inside of
James.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Destructured incorrectly. Curly braces instead of square brackets.
Ah, thank you. See, this is the beauty of having people.
And that was
what?
That was Zach Butcher, our first speaker from the evening. So we like to share the love here at Reactadelphia.
Yes, thank you for the support. I appreciate that. Now let's see if this will, let's refresh just to make sure we're good. Thank you for that. Appreciate it. And now, hopefully, if we click our login button, we should be redirected to Auth0. You can see that the URL up here changed. By creating an application by default, it will give you the ability to register with a username and password. They also have a development API key for the Google API. So I can actually log in with my Google account now. In production, I would want to make sure that I grab my Google credentials and then put them inside of the dashboard for Auth0 to get the real production one. But for now, I can just log in with my personal one. And this will finish that authentication process after I let it know, hey, I'm cool with it grabbing my profile and email. And then it will make it back to the application. Now for us, we can't really tell anything is happening. So inside of our Navbar, we can, let's say we only want to show the profile page if the user is authenticated. So we have that referenced above. So is authenticated, and I see if I can get this JSX working correctly. Does that look right? Yep. And then we'll also put, if we're authenticated, we'll also add the log out button. So let's add the log out button up here. So if that's the case, if we are authenticated, we'll show the profile page and the log out button. If that's not the case, if we are not authenticated, then we will show the log in button. So now when we scroll back over, we should see, hey, let's log in. And we get the same thing. Let's log in with Google. It'll do all the redirect stuff after we choose, hey, that's okay. And I've got some styling stuff to work on, but you can see I've got the logout page and then the profile button is showing. So this is at least showing that we're able to track the user. What's probably not very impressive though, is that we have no idea if that's actually working. We just think it says authenticated. So let's work on the profile page. Let's open that up. And what I want to do, where did I put my notes from earlier so I can grab those? I'm going to grab this piece of JSX and then add the R for return. Something like that. And then I want to make sure to import use auth0. And then actually instead of fragment, I can just do empty ones here. So what this will do is it will show us basic profile information about the user just to show you that we're actually getting something. I didn't do the same thing again, did I? Can I read picture? Oh, let's just wrap this. If user and then wrap that whole thing. So if we have the user, then we will show the rest of this content. Anyone? Live coding is great. Let me grab, I'll just copy what they have because they're actually using the loading property, which if we had used it before, it wouldn't be as big of a deal. But basically, if it's loading or the user has not been defined yet, then we won't show the content. We'll go ahead and return. If we are done loading, we've actually got the user, then we can display the user. So let's come back. This says loading. What I want to do is log in again. And the reason I'm having to log in again is because these are test API credentials or test credentials for Google. If they were real credentials, I'd gone and set them up myself. I wouldn't have to log in again. It would track it until I actually log out. So that's the reason you're seeing me having to log in again, which is okay for demo purposes. And I'll choose my Gmail and log in. You see that switch, so it says we're logged in. Come over to profile, and now you can see some information that auth0 gives you back by default after you do handle a login authentication. So I get my picture here, so you could use that. I get my name, my email. Then there's different properties that auth0 basically takes all the different properties that you can get from these social providers, and it standardizes them. So no matter what provider the applicant or the developer uses or lets their users authenticate with, it can work with the same data using the same properties. So those are standardized. So this is just a look at that. Your email, your picture, your given name, family name, nickname, whether or not your email has been verified, and then a unique identifier for that user that you could use to relate back to something in your own personal database if you need to. And then last thing is logout button should actually work. So if we log out, it should handle that process. You see it gets reflected in the UI, the login button is back, and now we could go through the same process again. So how are we doing just for a couple minutes of wrap up? Got about 3 minutes. So inside of a React application, the couple things that you need to do is, one, create your application in Auth0. It'll give you a couple of credentials. You'll have access to the quick start to go and do the same type of stuff that I just did. You'll install the Auth0 spa.js package. Then there's the big boilerplate file. This one here, where is this? And this basically exposes everything that you need using the context API and hooks to do things like log in, check whether the user is authenticated, check whether the loading process has finished, whether or not the user has actually finished the interaction of logging in, or whether or not behind the scenes a automatic login process is going on, and logouts and that sort of stuff. And then you wrap your application like a regular context provider as you would in React. And then you have access to that stuff in your different components, and you can do whatever you need to handle the authentication or displaying of content or not. The next step, I'm sure you've seen it before, creating a private route inside of React. I can actually show you the snippet here. By creating a private route, let me open this up. Where is this? We can actually secure the profile page. So even though we don't show the link to the profile page inside of the application when the user isn't logged in theory, they could manually type in /profile and go to that page. You can create a private route component like this. You can check that out later if you want, or ask questions later. Dump that into your code, wrap that profile route with the protected route component, and then that will automatically send them off to initiate that login process with Auth0. So all the details that you could ever want to know about OpenID Connect and OAuth2, you don't have to know them. I would recommend understanding the basics of what's going on, but some provider out there, an example being Auth0, can take care of the majority of that stuff for you so that you can go ahead and focus on building your application and not worried about implementing the latest specific features of authentication in the safest form for your single page application. So that's the demo. That's how easy it is to get started. I don't know how long people will stick around, but I've got plenty of time. So if you have any questions, feel free to shout them out.
Yeah, thanks so much, James. That was awesome. Does anybody have any questions? We've got some time with James, I'm sorry. Things are going crazy over here, James.
No worries, all good.
All right, I'll just hand it to somebody else and I'll stop talking.
Thank you, James. I don't have a reason for this question, but it kind of jumped out at me. The kind of information you got that you kind of displayed in that profile page there, that identifier at the end, is that unique to the user? Is that a combination of the user and the application, the user and the, I forget the name, but like kind of the profile on UF you had set up, et cetera?
Yep, good question. So that unique identifier is unique to Auth0. So it will take, I think what it does is it combines, let's go to this profile page, and I can zoom in pretty high on here. So what we're talking about is this part right here. I think what it does is it definitely prefixes the unique identifier with whatever the social provider is. So in this case, it's Google-OAuth2, and then pipe, and then some sort of kind of follow-up unique identifier that Auth0 generates, but that thing by itself is not necessarily unique. What is unique is the full ID, which is the combination of the method and that ID in the end separated by the pipe. So that whole thing is your unique user ID across Auth0.
Awesome. Anybody else got a question? Oh, Zach. All right. Coming right back. I'll just leave the mic here.
So I just had a question regarding server-side rendering or static build apps, like something you get when you build Gatsby. Do you have other specific implementation differences when you're using Auth0 in those types of platforms versus just a generic create React app, or is it pretty much the same setup?
Yeah, great question. So that was actually, I had an application that I'm building for a talk I'm doing next week, which is a Gatsby application. And I thought about doing that for tonight, but I figured I would kind of separate out and just do React versus Gatsby. Anyway, the main difference is the way that we wrap our component. Let's see, in the index.js, the way that we kind of wrap our application with the Auth0 provider, there's a special way that you have to do that inside of Gatsby. And that's really there may be like one other subtle difference, but I think that's the main difference in Gatsby is like you don't have direct access to like the root component. So I think there's like a wrap root element API in Gatsby, and you use that, and then you basically do the same kind of thing where you wrap it with the Auth0 provider. And then the other piece of the workflow is the same. So you still use the hook you have access to, and you do the same kind of calls. You call login and logout and profile or user, get user, and that kind of stuff. So most of it is exactly the same, except for kind of wrapping that root element is a little bit special in Gatsby.
All right, we got time for one more. Anybody? No, I think that's it, James. I think you.
Wait a second. I got a Twitch question.
Okay.
Spoke too soon.
Oh, but it's totally Mimi. Hold on. What am I reading here?
Do we have more candy that I can hoard like a trash panda and take home? I can't answer that one, but
there might be candy around here. I don't know.
All right, I guess that's it, James. Thanks so much for joining us remotely. Everybody, let's give it up for James Q. Quick of Auth0. Thank you so much.